Greetings, my lovelies. This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Sin City 2: A Dame to Kill For. And wow, I actually got a video up on time. Sort of. No, in the past you would have been able to get it up by Friday. Well, shut up. One step at a time. Anyway, when it comes to the first Sin City, it's one of those few films that almost transcends objective quality. It's less about whether it's good or bad, and more about whether you like or dislike it. It all comes down to how you respond to its style, from the visuals to the acting to the dialogue. The comic books presented themselves as examples of neo-noir, but taken to exaggerated extremes. The characters all seem like caricatures of, characters who belong in 1940s gangster flicks, except there's a lot of twists about them that you wouldn't have seen back then. They're much more morally ambiguous. They seem to struggle with their sanity, and they're significantly more violent and vicious. And the visual style is almost like a parody of film noir, but that is part of its appeal. And what the film did is that it didn't just decide to adapt its neo-noir setting, it also wanted to play out like a live-action comic book that just happened to have a neo-noir setting. And when you watch Sin City, you might think it's really cool for this. You might like the way how characters talk or what they're saying, and you might think that the black and white backgrounds are, really neat, or you might think that it's trying way too hard to sound cool, and that the entire film ends up coming across as very phony for it. I understand both sides of the argument. I saw it with my dad, and I liked the film, even though I do think that it's in danger of being overrated. I don't consider it to be a great film, but it's at least unique and memorable. I only saw it once when I saw it in theaters, and I haven't seen it since then, so I'm actually, that does say something to the film's credit that I remember so much about it. Whereas my dad, he didn't like it at all. He thought the whole idea was stupid, and he actually ended up falling asleep after a certain point. But you're either a Sin City fan, you love it, or you're a Sin City detractor, you hate it. I've seen very little in between, which is strange because Sin City 2 is the total opposite. When I actually have, all the reviews I've read or watched when it comes to this movie, I've heard very few people admit that they loved it, but then very few people admit that they hated it either. It seems like all the opinions are in between. The majority of the viewers are very lukewarm, and I'm one of those viewers. I thought it was okay. It was a more serviceable sequel than The Expendables 3 was, and it's nowhere near as awful as something like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. If I were to compare it to anything, it would be 300 Rise of an Empire, and that I enjoyed myself. It did enough right to where it can truly call itself a sequel, and I appreciate the areas where it tried to be a little different, but at the same time, very little of this movie stands out. I only watched Sin City once when it came out in theaters, but I remember so much of it. Whereas with Sin City 2, I don't think I'm going to remember any of it a week from now. So let's go into the visual style. What the first film did was that it was just mostly a black and white film with some CGI touches, especially in the backgrounds, that did give it a very comic booky feel. Well, I thought this film actually took that farther. It definitely resembled the comic book a lot more in how it used shadows and the stark coloring. The black and white really stand out more, as if they were outright colored in, whereas in the first film it was just conventionally black and white. I thought it was pretty cool. There are a lot of just various shots and visual ideas that you could almost tell were taken out directly from the comic book, but then you learn that the majority of the stories in this film weren't part of the original comic book. They were thought up exclusively for this movie, so interesting. But like, the action scenes were really well done. I liked how it used gore and blood. I liked the black comedy which accompanied the action scenes. you know, when you see people get decapitated and dismembered and all sorts of horrible things done to them, the fact that this film can make you laugh at that's pretty impressive. Every once in a while there will be another color that will make its appearance. For example, when Eva Green is first introduced, she's wearing a blue dress, and the blue really does stand out, and her eyes always seem to stand out as well. And I really liked that because it kept the primary color scheme, the black and white, from becoming monotonous. Every time I started to get a little sick of it, another character will show up and they'll have blonde hair, and that will really stand out, and that will just freshen things up a bit. So I thought the use of colors really did add a lot to the atmosphere, if it didn't totally create the atmosphere it was going for. Now, anybody who watches Sin City or Sin City 2, their attention is mostly going to be directed towards the visual style, and because I think this film excelled in that regard, that immediately makes Sin City 2 passable in my mind. Now, the narrative is where the movie starts to flounder. God, this is going to be difficult to explain, and I want to emphasize that I don't think any of these stories failed in themselves. They were all passably written. At times, there's even a touch of inspiration there. But at the same time, it seemed like Sin City 2 favors one story over the others. Now, the episodic narrative structure was a very polarizing attribute of the first film, but I thought the first film did a good job at balancing all these stories. Each of them were compelling for different reasons, and I never felt that one overtook the others to where it hurt the overall project. In this case, though, it starts off with Mickey Rourke, and he has this segment where he declares war on some college students who are burning homeless people. It adds nothing to the rest of the story, but it does a good job at introducing that character, and it works as a standalone side story. But that lasts maybe 10 minutes or so. Then it cuts to Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, and it starts going into his story, and then before you could really get attached to that character and his plight, it cuts to Jessica Alba's character, and you learn about what she's been doing since the first movie. And but once again, before you could really make an attachment, it goes back to Joseph Gordon-Levitt's, and I felt that it just never. There was never enough time dedicated to any of these segments during the first half to where I could bring myself to care. But then it goes to Dwight's story, and for some baffling reason, even though the other stories don't seem to take more than 10 minutes each, the Dwight story seems to go on for about 50 minutes or so, and I'm not entirely sure whether that's the accurate running time, but it does take up the majority of the second act. It feels like it's its own movie. It has a legitimate first act, a legitimate second act, and a legitimate third act. And when it climaxes, I felt like the entire movie climaxed with it. And I was ready to go home, but oh wait, it just ends and there's still like 30 minutes more to go so they could resolve the other stories. And I thought the Dwight story was still well done. It's just, I don't know, I hear apparently the Dwight story is the only one that was taken from the comics. The other stories, they were just created specifically for this film. Well, I think they probably should have just simplified it and made it a streamlined narrative that focused entirely on Dwight and his situation with Ava Lord. That would have been compelling enough, I think. Then you could bring in all these characters, and you'd have to make some changes to the comic book story, but it would have, I think, made things easier to swallow. But the fact that it insisted on an episodic structure, even though it doesn't feel very episodic, it makes these other episodes seem more like padding. It just, to me, kind of brought down the entire narrative. But then there's also some random additions that I understood why they included them, but they seemed like they were going somewhere only for them to go nowhere. Like, there's this character named Mort, and he's introduced, and he falls in love with Eva Lord, who's obviously manipulating him, and you're thinking this is going to lead to some sort of confrontation with Dwight, but then it doesn't. Now, if memory serves, that happened the same way in the comic books, but comic books can afford a looser structure to where those little side stories do feel in place, and I think if this took place during the first film, because it had such a better balance, it would have worked better there. But once again, in this movie, it just kind of seemed like an odd addition. So that really hurt the pacing at times. But also, the timeline is really, really screwed up. Admittedly, when it came to the first film, they didn't take place in chronological order. So a character would die early in the movie, then show up again later in the movie because this story took place before the previous story. But for some reason it didn't bother me there, and I'm not really sure why it bothered me here so much, because at times it was being a sequel to the events of Sin City, and then at other times a prequel, and maybe that's just it, because you're taking the events of Sin City and trying to incorporate them into the events of this movie. So Dwight's whole segment presumably takes place before his segment in the first film, whereas I can't think of her name right. Jessica Alba's character, Nancy, her segment takes place after the events of the first film, so it just drew more attention to the real screwed up timeline, and that sometimes did confuse me. When it comes to the characters, I thought it was strange because the heroes are less interesting than the heroes of the first film, while the villains are more interesting than the villains of the first film. Although, I could see many people disagreeing with me there. Marv is definitely still the standout character. He's the most awesome, but even then I thought he was just more compelling in the first film, although he's still compelling here. Dwight, to me, is the one who I thought really took a step down in terms of being interesting. Even though I like Josh Brolin, he does good. It felt like Dwight was just much more of a standard, protagonist who he's kind of dumb in this movie, even though at least the film does draw attention to it, and you do understand why, but I liked the more unstable Dwight of the first Sin City, and I thought Clive Owen just fit that character a little bit more. Even though you could argue that, he's developed since then, that, the events of this film made him more unstable and kind of creepier in the second film. But it almost felt like they were two separate characters, and the character from the first film was just better. Who else is there? They try to make Nancy, or if that is her name, more compelling, but I never thought Jessica Alba did that great, and that just kind of brought down that character. Bruce Willis shows up as his ghost, and he's there enough to where you could justify his name being used in the marketing campaign, but he doesn't. He could have showed up more, I guess, because I thought he was a really well-written character in the first film. So I was kind of disappointed that he pretty much just gets an extended cameo here. But then Joseph Gordon-Levitt, his character actually was pretty interesting, and by the end of his segment, I really did care for him, but he just didn't have enough screen time dedicated to him to where he stood out as much as the heroes from the first film. Now, when it comes to the villains, though, it just seemed like the film was more interested in the villains than the first movie was. Even though Kevin and the Yellow Bastard, they were compelling characters. In a lot of ways, especially Kevin, I think is going to be the most memorable villain of this entire franchise, if they continue making more movies. But at the same time, I liked how Eva Lord and Senator Rourke, they just had more to do here, and you love to hate them. Eva Green is perfect in playing these kinds of man-eating roles, and that's all she seems to be doing lately with 300: Rise of an Empire and Dark Shadows. But this kind of movie, it provides the perfect platform for her to really go all out and just be incredibly hammy, but she's so entertaining for it. And Powers Booth as Senator Rourke, man, he didn't have a whole lot to do in the first movie, and he was overshadowed by pretty much everybody else. But here, you just love to hate him. He's such a sleazeball, but he's so sinister and evil, and yet charismatic too. Unlike Yellow Bastard, who's just straight up, you just want to see this fucker die. I wanted to see more of Senator Rourke. He was just that entertaining. So I could see why people would disagree with me, because the villains in the first film were in some ways more memorable, but they just weren't present enough to be, I don't know, to entertain me as much as they could have. I wanted more of Kevin, but this film at least gave me more of the villains, so I was happy about that. And that's really all I have to say. Sin City 2 is thoroughly alright. I think it's worth watching if you liked the first film, but if you didn't like Sin City 1 or were just indifferent to it, you're not going to like this film. Uh, you know, if anything, it's the first film, except the novelty has worn off by now, and there are more standout flaws. But if you were a huge fan of Sin City 1, I'd say this is worth watching in theaters. And if you were, a fan of Sin City 1, but you weren't necessarily in love with it, you merely liked it, then maybe you should just wait till it comes out on DVD or Blu-ray. So that is all I have to say. I did not do a written review of this, but I did do written reviews of All Cheerleaders Die, the 2013 remake, The Expendables 2, as well as I made a vlog on that. Joyride 3, and that's all I really remember. So please read those. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. I keep forgetting to say this, but if you like wrestling, or more specifically the WWE, I review all the wrestling shows on my Facebook page. So friend me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys later.